Is life better in the USA or Canada? That is the question we'll be exploring today, and in this video, I'm going to show you the data and my personal experience so that you can make your own decision, and at the very end, I'll give you my honest answer.
Is life better in America or Canada?
Oh, okay, this is going to be a tough one. But in order to have that discussion, we first have to set up two frames. Frame 1. This video is based on my own research and experience. I've spent over 20 years in Canada and the last few years in the States, and while I've done my best to give an accurate comparison, keep in mind there are still nuances that I'm gonna miss. These are huge countries with tons of diverse people, so ultimately I will be generalizing. That being said though, if you want to dive deeper, I've left all of my sources in an annotated bibliography down below. Frame 2, I love both countries. I love Canada and I love America. I'm not here to pick sides or declare one as superior than the other, because what does that even mean? Things are just different, y'all, and at the end of the day, it's whatever's best for you. Now on to our first topic of 6, which is income. When it comes to comparing the cost of living and income between Canada and the USA, we first have to acknowledge that it's not as simple as just slapping a price tag on a country and calling it a day. Salaries can vary dramatically, not just between countries, but between regions in the same country, and sometimes even between neighborhoods in the same city. So that's why instead of relying on national averages, which tend to blur things, I've pulled data for 5 Canadian cities and 5 American counterparts of a similar size, economic profile, and regional role. The first pair is Toronto versus Chicago. They're both major financial hubs along the Great Lakes with a similar population and climate. Some might think to compare Toronto to New York, but I don't think that's exactly fair. First of all, the population of the New York metropolitan area is 3 times bigger than the greater Toronto area. And furthermore, New York City is a global powerhouse. It attracts businesses, artists, investment from all over the world. And while yes, Toronto is significant as well, it doesn't one-to-one match the exact scale of New York City. Next up, we have Montreal versus Boston. Both are historic cities with a similar population size, and also major healthcare and education hubs. Montreal has McGill, and Boston has Harvard and MIT. Next one is pretty straightforward. We have my hometown Vancouver versus Seattle. They're both tech hubs in the Pacific Northwest and just 3 hours away from each other. Next is Calgary versus Denver. Both are energy and natural resource hubs near the Rockies. And lastly, we have Winnipeg versus Minneapolis. Both are really cold, similar population, and relatively affordable compared to the larger cities. This should give us a balanced mix of larger cities and regional hubs, but what do you think? Let me know if you think these comparisons are fair, or if you have any other suggestions. Alright, let's dive into the incomes. These are the estimated median total household incomes for all of our Canadian cities as of 2024. On the lower side, we have Winnipeg at almost $80,000 a year, and Calgary sitting in the 6 figures. These are the estimated median household incomes for our American cities. We can see here that in 3 of our 5 American cities, the median household is making over 6 figures a year. Now, first reaction might be, oh, income in America is so much higher than Canada, therefore life is better, case closed. But this isn't the full picture.
Yes, salaries in the US are higher, but there's a caveat, right? It depends on which state you look into.
Anastasia is one half of the YouTube channel Make That Change, which talks about all things Canada. They recently did a comprehensive cost of living analysis that I'm using as inspiration for this video.
I was shocked to learn that salaries in the US vary so much. Someone in Mississippi or in those southern states make literally 3x less than some other states. I knew there was variability, but not that much. That was huge for me.
So let's see how far that income goes, starting with taxes. Now, there's a common misconception that income tax in Canada is much, much higher than in America.
Canadians are getting crushed by taxes.
Too much tax, too much control. Don't come to Canada.
And it certainly feels that way. I thought this for a while myself. But when we run the numbers on each of these city pairs, we can see that the percentage of your total income going to the government isn't actually that far apart. For our American cities, 25.6% of your income goes to federal, state, and FICA on average. And in Canada, that average is 26.8%. Now, it's important to note here that these are on-paper tax rates, meaning if you were to run the median household income in each of these cities through an income tax calculator for that state or province, this is how much you'd be paying on paper before any deductions, any credits, or write-offs. But of course, everyone's tax situation is different. You might have deductions and credits, so it all really depends. Altogether though, in both countries, you'll be keeping around 74-ish% of your income as estimated annual take-home pay. And when we divide these figures by 12, we get an estimated monthly income for each of our cities. But this isn't the full picture.
We must not look at just incomes. You could be making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but if you're spending all of those hundreds of thousands of dollars, that does not really make the difference. You're just kind of spinning the gears. It's not how much money flows in, it's how much money you're actually able to retain.
Which brings us to our second factor out of 6, cost of living. We'll take a look at 3 different expense categories to figure out how far your income actually goes in each of these cities. Let's start by looking at rent. According to crowdsourced data from the platform Numbeo, these are the average rents for a 1-bedroom apartment in the city center. As a general rule of thumb, financial experts say that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your gross monthly income on rent. Unfortunately, only 5 of our cities here meet that mark. In fact, in Vancouver, things are so bad that a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown will eat up nearly 52% of your monthly paycheck if you're making the median income. In comparison though, a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Seattle will only take up 30% of your monthly income. There's also a small difference between Boston and Montreal, but other than that, things are pretty close. Next up, let's look at other household expenses like groceries. For 2 people eating a 2,000 calorie per day diet, this is how much a month of groceries might cost you in each of our cities. The top axis is in US dollars and the bottom is in Canadian. They're both aligned using a PPP adjustment factor of 1.17, so each dollar on the top axis represents $1.17 on the bottom axis. And as a percentage of income, you'll be spending more in Canada than in the US. But why is that?
US is an agricultural country, so I think US has the luxury of producing a lot of crops in the country, whereas Canada does not have that much luxury. Most of the country is the Canadian Shield, which is pretty much unharvestable.
And so overall, when we look at rent and household expenses as a percentage of your monthly income, this is where we really start to see things diverge. Canadians in all of our cities are spending more on their basic living expenses than their American counterparts. This is especially true between Vancouver and Seattle, where that difference is almost 36%. What is going on with Vancouver?
You tell me what is happening. Just the numbers don't seem to make sense. And honestly, I thought when I was doing the math, I just missed something. Someone in the comments told us that what happens most of the time is just people live either with their families or with their roommates, so they kind of split housing costs, and that really is the biggest thing they do to reduce their cost of living.
But this isn't the full picture because we're missing one last really big thing that might be able to close the gap, and that is healthcare. Health insurance costs in the US can vary dramatically depending on the state you live in and the type of plan you have. For example, if you have an ACA plan without any credits in Illinois, it'll cost you $473 a month. But if you live in Massachusetts and you have tax credits, it'll cost you only $34. So because of this variance, I'll just be meeting in the middle and using an employer-sponsored plan as the benchmark. This is how most Americans get their health insurance anyways. Healthcare in Canada is largely free at the point of care and funded through taxes, which we've already deducted. Still, some Canadians opt to get optional supplementary insurance for things that aren't covered. And no matter what your plan type and where you live, there are still out-of-pocket expenses like copays and deductibles to account for. So if we take all the expenses we've discussed, rent, household, and healthcare, and add them all up, we start to see that, aside from this monstrosity, the cost of living gap isn't actually that big. For 3 of our 5 city pairs, the gap is only 2%, making them effectively equivalent. And between Minneapolis and Winnipeg, that difference is about 10%. The biggest disparity here is between Vancouver and Seattle, where that gap is 35%. God, this is exactly why I left. Literally, the math doesn't math. Like, what? In any case, these are general trends and estimates of averages, so there's huge margin here for individual variability. It really depends on you. But there's an important question that we have yet to answer. Cost of living doesn't account for quality of life. And if the cost of living is relatively similar between these 2 countries, what are you actually getting for your money? What does living in one country get you compared to another? After all, we're trying to figure out, where is life better? Well, let's take a look at career opportunities.
Tech workers in the U.S. are paid at least 46% more than tech workers in Canada. That's according to a new report highlighting the wage gap.
Canada struggles with a slight brain drain problem. I came across this survey from the University of Waterloo, which has one of the top software engineering programs in Canada. And the survey says that in 2020, 84% of Waterloo software engineering grads reported that they plan to work in the US upon graduating. And of those leaving Canada, 93% cited better compensation as one factor that would have motivated them to stay in Canada.
I feel like that checks out. There's like a website called levels.fyi that basically like lays out approximately how much a lot of software companies in the US pays. Like you go on the website and you see like L4 engineer at Google makes this much, L5 engineer at Google makes this much. A lot of like Waterloo, like computer science or software engineering students like go on that site and they see that the jobs in the US like pay significantly more than the ones in Canada.
And this gap extends beyond just the tech world. I'm a musician by trade, and amongst my musician friends back home in Canada, there's this saying, if you want to be a famous Canadian artist, move to America.
As a musician or a filmmaker or whatever, somewhere in the arts specifically, you get to a certain level in Canada, which, yes, it's difficult you have to be very good and skilled and have a lot of connections, but to kind of go any further, you got to move to the States. I mean, I'm in the hub of that in Canada, which is Toronto. But now that I've spent some time in like places like Los Angeles or New York City, like it's not the same.
America is for the ambitious. Here, there are massive industrial hubs that have no real equivalent in Canada. Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Ivy League, Hollywood. And furthermore, some of the world's top schools are here. People flock from all over the world to study at places like Harvard, MIT, and UC Berkeley. And that's actually part of the reason I'm here. I study at the fake Berkeley College of Music, but within the music world, it's considered by many to be the best contemporary music school on the planet. There's no real equivalent program like this in Canada. Now, this isn't to say that you can't go far in Canada. Of course you can. The Toronto-Waterloo corridor is one of the fastest growing tech hubs in North America. And furthermore, with the rise of remote work, you can pursue an ambitious career from virtually anywhere, be it a small town or a beach in Bali. At the same time, even with places like the Toronto-Waterloo corridor making big strides, they still don't match one-to-one the sheer scale and economic impact of the American market. And so, if you're trying to optimize for your career and material success, then America might be a good place to be, depending on your sector.
I do admire the US ambition and the kind of obsession maybe with work, just generally speaking. And again, it's not for everyone. I have a lot of friends who I went to school with who are now in New York or in the Silicon Valley. They specifically went for that so that they could work more, achieve more, make more money.
But of course, career isn't everything, and this kind of intense work culture can burn a lot of people out.
I wanted to live in Los Angeles. That was my dream. And I had the opportunity to do it. I could have moved and it could have been all covered. I could have got the visa. I could have done the thing. And I decided not to because my values just changed as I got older and it was less of what you're talking about. I would rather have the simpler life.
The US has a reputation for hustle. American workers work, on average, nearly 15 workdays more than their Canadian counterparts, except in 2023, which I'm still unsure of what happened here. Kind of looks like a huge anomaly, so I'll just be examining the prior years. According to research from Isgut et al., over 40% of the gap is due to Canadians taking more time off, particularly higher income Canadians taking more vacation time than their American counterparts.
In all three of the jobs that I've had in Canada, it's always seen as like, hey, when you're expected to be here, you need to be here, but also you need to take vacation. It's like, we're paying you to not be here for a little while so that you can be a better worker for us. Whereas in the States, especially if you work an hourly job, it's always seen as like you're the problem if you're not working. It's almost like anytime you are not here, you're a burden for us.
Canada has a minimum of 2 weeks vacation requirements. Some companies are offering more, and then depending on how long you stay at the company, you're entitled to longer vacation times, and it's something you can negotiate. In the US, as far as I know, there's no minimum vacation requirement, so it's at full discretion of the employer.
Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Canada lacks ambition. It definitely doesn't. You can find whatever you're looking for in any country. It's just that from my perspective, Canadian culture overall just places greater emphasis on balance. And a big part of that balance is healthcare. All right, it's time to address the elephant in the room, and this could very well be a deciding factor for our final verdict. Let's start by comparing the two systems. Canada has a universal single-payer healthcare system. This means all citizens and residents of Canada can get necessary medical services without any charges at point of care. Most services, except for prescriptions, dental, and vision, are covered by the government through taxes. In contrast, the American healthcare system is a multi-payer system. Most Americans receive health insurance through private insurers, usually tied to their employer, or, for those without employers, are purchased privately. But even with some public programs like Medicare and Medicaid, around 7.6%, or 25 million Americans, have no insurance at all. Now, while this is a clear structural difference between these two countries, I don't think it's as simple as just saying free and good versus expensive and bad. I think both systems actually have advantages and disadvantages. And as a guy with chronic health conditions, this has been particularly relevant to me lately. So the other day, I found myself in the ER in New York.
Funniest story.
And while I was woozy out of my mind on the medications that they had given me, I was signing a financial responsibility contract and contacting my insurer. And that was just such a culture shock moment for me because I have never experienced that before. That's like not something you think about in Canada. Now, luckily, I have the luxury of good health insurance, meaning I only had to pay $150 for the ER visit as opposed to the out-of-pocket cost of $7,000. That's just one example, though.
7.4% of U.S. residents face catastrophic healthcare bills each year. That's more than double the next closest country.
100 million people in this country currently have some kind of healthcare debt. That's about 40% of adults.
Which leads us to one of the biggest issues with the American healthcare system, the cost to individuals. The fact that if I didn't have adequate health insurance meant that I could be paying $7,000 for an ER visit or $20,000 for a necessary medical procedure is absolutely mind-boggling to me. My Canadian brain cannot comprehend it. Just to put it into perspective, healthcare in Canada, except for prescriptions, dental, and vision, is largely free. Like for my American friends, imagine walking into the doctor's office and not having to give your insurance card, not having to check if they're in network, not having to worry about copay, deductibles, all that kind of stuff. You just walk in, get treated, and they're like, okay, bye. Most Canadians don't have crazy medical bills, and furthermore, don't even worry about it.
People always ask my wife and I, you're like, oh, how'd you guys choose Vancouver over San Diego? Or like, what was the deciding factor? Well, healthcare is one thing. If we were making the same amount of money, but living in the States, but also needing to pay for healthcare, because my wife and I don't have the luxury of saying like, well, you know, we can just cross our fingers. It's like, I have a heart condition. I have to have regular medical expenses and whatnot. So I have to have health insurance.
So this is a big plus for the Canadian system, but it is not a perfect system. There's a lot of flaws and there's a lot of drawbacks, the most glaring of which are wait times.
If you've ever been referred to a specialist here in Canada, you know wait times are at an all-time high. In 2023, it took on average 27.7 weeks to see a specialist. So that means it took 14.6 weeks from referral to a specialist consultation, and then an additional 13.1 week wait from that consultation to actually receiving treatment.
But these wait times aren't just inconvenient, they're dangerous.
After fighting to see an oncologist for almost 3 months, an Edmonton man died of cancer without ever getting an appointment.
Lengthy wait times for emergency care have become all too familiar right across the country. According to Dr. Warren Thirsk, since May in Alberta alone, 7 patients have died waiting for emergency care.
And this is especially important for people like Samuel.
I have a heart condition, and whenever I would need to go to the doctor, whether it was a routine appointment or even just kind of like, hey, like, you know, I've been having some chest pain, I could schedule an appointment with my cardiologist directly and it would be at most 2 weeks out. Whereas here, I've been running into some issues with that. I've been here for almost 3 years and there's still certain like baseline testing that they haven't scheduled for me.
On the other hand, in the US, wait times are much shorter, which is pretty great. I get in and out to see a specialist super quickly, but this isn't the full picture. You see, wait times appear shorter in large part because millions of underinsured and uninsured people aren't getting care. Again, as of 2023, 7.6% of Americans have no insurance, and 61% of them report skipping needed care because of the high costs. And 25% of all Americans say that they have delayed care in the last 12 months because they're worried about the costs.
I have experienced that a lot with patients that come in with pneumonia and came in when it got worse and had to be admitted to the hospital. And we're like, why didn't you come in sooner? Well, I couldn't afford this bill, so I was trying to take care of myself.
And this difference in access is most evident in the fact that Canadians, on average, live 5 years longer than Americans. And on top of that, out of all the OECD countries, the US has the highest rates of avoidable deaths, infant mortality, and maternal mortality. Now, these differences in outcomes are more about access than quality, because once you're getting treated, the care you'll get in both countries is pretty much the same.
The quality of the care when I'm actually seeing a doctor or when I've been in the ER, basically the same. But the actual time frame has been a pretty big difference.
So to summarize, both systems deliver high-quality healthcare once you're in. It's just that the American system is really expensive but has shorter wait times, while in Canada it's free but has longer wait times. So you're either paying with your time or your money. There are no free lunches. But healthcare is only one part of what we'd call social benefits. Both countries take really different approaches to these, so let's take a look at 3 big benefits. First up, let's look at parental leave. Canada has one of the most generous parental leave programs in North America. Canadian parents can take up to 18 months of combined maternal and parental leave. On the other hand, the US has no federally mandated paid parental leave. Paid leave depends entirely on your state or employer, so as a result, only about 27% of American workers have access to paid family leave. Another benefit is subsidized childcare. Canada recently began rolling out their $10 a day childcare program, which aims to make daycare more accessible and affordable.
The goal is to reduce the price of childcare down to $10 a day on average across Ontario by 2025.
On the other hand, US childcare costs are among the highest in the OECD.
I think the biggest takeaway that I've had from doing that analysis is really bogging down to whether or not you plan to start a family. If you plan to start a family, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive in either country, but it's going to be more expensive in the US.
Next up are unemployment benefits. Canada's employment insurance program provides up to 45 weeks of financial support if you lose your job through no fault of your own, with a cap at $650 a week. In the US, as before, unemployment benefits largely depend on where you live. Most states offer up to about 26 weeks, but the weekly cap can vary widely, from $235 a week in Mississippi to about $1,000 in Massachusetts, with the average weekly benefit being around $378. And lastly, retirement benefits. Canada's retirement system has 3 key components. CPP works like a savings plan. You contribute while you work, and then when you retire, you receive monthly benefits based on how much you've contributed. OAS is a universal pension available to all seniors, and GIS is a needs-based supplement for low-income seniors. This tiered approach ensures that all Canadian seniors, regardless of their income level, have some basic level of financial security. The US has Social Security, which functions similar to CPP. You contribute while you work, and then when you retire, you get monthly payments based on lifetime earnings. If you're a high-income earner, Social Security can be pretty great for you, but if you're a lower-income retiree, you might be a little bit more vulnerable unless you have some other private savings. Ultimately, it's clear that Canada's social safety net is more comprehensive, whether it's longer parental leave, more consistent unemployment benefits, or a tiered retirement system. Canada's social programs are designed with a focus on equity and access. Meanwhile, in the US, your benefits largely depend on where you live and where you work. So if you're in a higher paying job with good benefits or live in a state that has great coverage, you're set. But in other cases, you might be left fending for yourself with minimal support. Now here's where things get nuanced. America's safety net isn't entirely patchy, and there are programs that provide relief. For example, Medicaid covers millions of low-income Americans, and states like California and Massachusetts offer some pretty comprehensive protections. So it's not like all Americans are left fending for themselves because the government won't give them benefits. No, of course, self-responsibility and self-reliance are really important values. It's just that access to these programs is a bit more challenging than you'd find in Canada. Which leads me to conclude that while the economic upside is bigger in America, so too is the potential downside. What do I mean by this? Okay, you can make more money in America. The ceiling is overall higher, the companies are bigger, there's just a huge market and really, really competitive wages. But at the same time, I also think that the floor is overall lower. Because America's social programs vary so much from state to state and from individual to individual, if you fall on hard times, it can be a lot more dire. For example, if you're struggling financially, and then you get sick, and then you lose your job, and then because of that you fall into medical debt, that is really, really tough. And this isn't just some extreme example, medical debt is a leading cause of bankruptcy in the US. On the other hand, Canada has a relatively strong social safety net, meaning if you fall on hard times, you're not completely screwed. You can still access healthcare because it's free, unemployment insurance, and retirement benefits. And that kind of security can give a lot of peace of mind.
In Canada, we're in a little more the happy medium. Everything else is just a little, the contrast is less.
Compressed.
Exactly. These things still exist. There's poverty, as there is everywhere, and there's success, as there is everywhere. But those things are both little less than in America. So it's like just taking on that risk or like deciding again, what's important to you.
So to summarize, while the economic upside is bigger in America, so too is the potential downside. And it all depends on how well you can personally manage the risk that you face in either country. Are you someone who can mitigate those risks with savings, insurance, and a high-paying job? Or do you prefer to have the peace of mind and predictability that comes from a more reliable safety net? It all depends on your personal values and what you're optimizing for. Now it's on to our final factor before our verdict: livability. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2023 Global Livability Index, these are the top 10 most livable cities in the world. We can see here that my hometown of Vancouver is at 5th place on this list, alongside 2 other large Canadian cities. Now, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Or rather, not seeing? The highest ranking American city is Honolulu, Hawaii, coming in at 25th place. The next highest American cities are Atlanta at 33rd and Pittsburgh at 34th. In fact, according to The Economist, cities in the United States have never hit the global top 10 in the index's 14-year history. But why is that? Well, first of all, this index puts a lot of emphasis on healthcare access, which, as we've discussed before, can be a bit of a challenge in the United States. But there are also other key factors here, and I'll focus on 3 main areas. First of all, Canadian cities on average are cleaner than American cities. I don't have any statistics to show you here, but it is literally one of the first things that I noticed coming in here, and you can probably ask anyone who travels back and forth.
I find American cities to be very dirty compared to Canada, and I never thought that our streets were clean. And again, none of this is like hating on the country, it's just like observations.
That was one thing I'd noticed right away coming to Vancouver. Generally speaking, Vancouver is a very clean city, especially compared to Seattle. Downtown Seattle, I don't know when the last time you went, but it doesn't smell good ever.
Secondly, I noticed that many large American cities struggle with aging infrastructure, inefficient public transportation, and car-centric urban design. For example, cities like LA, Houston, and Atlanta are known for their car-centric urban sprawl and congestion. On the other hand, most of the big cities in Canada have excellent public transportation systems, bike networks, and pedestrian infrastructure. As a result, Canadians on average walk twice as often as their American counterparts, bike 3 times the miles, and are twice as likely to use public transportation.
Here we have local train systems, we have buses, and even like streetcars in Toronto, which I think is
so cool.
I love it. The public transit is a lot more developed, which gives us all a good alternative to not have to use our car at all times.
But lastly and most importantly, Canadian cities are safer than American cities. In 2022, the homicide rate in Canada was 2.25 per 100,000 people, whereas in the US, it was almost 3 times higher at 6.3 per 100,000 people. Here's how Canada and the US compare on 3 similarly defined offenses.
The gun thing is a big part of it, and I feel unsafe. Maybe not unsafe, but I definitely feel less safe. It's just knowing that, like, even if I may be safe, there's a possibility that something could happen. And obviously, gun crime is very high there compared to the rest of the world. So those kinds of things, like, I do feel way safer in Canada.
So now that we've gone through all 6 factors, it's finally time to answer the question we've all been waiting for.
Is life better in America or Canada?
Oh, okay, this is going to be a tough one. Canada is, on almost every measurable indicator, more livable than the US. Life expectancy is longer, it's safer, and healthcare access is more equitable. On the other hand, though, America offers really unique economic opportunities because of all the industrial hubs that are here. The ceiling is overall higher, there's so much money going around, the wages are really competitive, and so it's a really tough call. At the end of the day, it's all trade-offs. You'll find good and bad on both sides of the border, and more importantly, you can architect whatever life you want wherever you are. And so ultimately, it's just what you're personally optimizing for and what's right for you. Now, I promised you that I would give you my honest take at the end of this video, so here goes. I'm still figuring it out. I really like the quality of life I had in Canada. But on the other hand, I also love all the unique economic opportunities that being here in the US affords me. Like, for example, right now, I'm literally going to the best contemporary music school on the planet. That's not an opportunity I can get back home. And furthermore, especially since I'm in the field of creative entrepreneurship, it's so much easier to network with like-minded creatives, to get funding for a startup, to go out and do the kinds of things that I want to do. And so because I'm interested in tech and entertainment and entrepreneurship, I think this is a really great place for me personally. But then again, as a guy with chronic health conditions who really values security, I feel safer and more taken care of in Canada. I don't need to worry about whether my insurer is accepted or decide whether or not to get treatment based on the cost. So to tell you the truth, my answer is still in progress. And there are so many factors playing into this decision that we haven't yet discussed. Most importantly, how are Americans and Canadians different as people? How is the culture different? All of which we're going to discuss in part 2 of this series, which you can watch right here.